Hi, everybody. Welcome to a new edition of Let's Talk About Education with Antonio Corrales. We have heard about research and the potential impact that research may have on students' life. We have heard about what are the new initiatives or the new methodologies for students to investigate or to research about particular topics. New generations, millennials, are relying heavily on Google and other internet search engines to find about different topics. But what does it mean to bring research to students' life? High school, college students, and even graduate students. What type of impact may research have on students' life? Well, today we have the honor to have with us Dr. Laurie Sharp. She's an expert on research, and she's going to be talking to us to explain us in simple terms the potential impact that research may have on students' life. Laurie, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely, absolutely. Why don't we start by letting you introduce yourself to the audience, kind of letting them know how do you get to where you are in your career?
Okay, well, I'm Laurie Sharp, and right now I'm affiliated with West Texas A&M, which is in Canyon, Texas. So I actually live 7 miles from Palo Duro Canyon. So it's a very picturesque part of the state, way up in the Panhandle. I'm a teacher educator, so I work with undergraduate students and graduate students. And primarily, I help students conduct research. My position's actually an endowed chair. And so one of the families that's in the community and one of the nonprofit agencies all got together and wanted to basically fund a position that keeps higher education connected with all aspects of education in the community. And so I actually work with public schools to help coordinate research that identify best practices in education. So in my role, I've had the pleasure of working with classroom teachers, principals, superintendents, even with nonprofit agencies that work with school districts in order to facilitate learning experiences. But before coming into higher education, I was also a classroom teacher. And so I did a lot of action-based research in my own classroom because essentially I had a lot of questions and I just wanted to inform my teaching practices about how I can enhance student learning and make it better.
That's awesome. Now that you mention it, and I'm going to put you in the spot there because, I teach strategic planning and I teach in the doctoral level. And you mentioned action research, and there's a lot of people out there that may have no idea what action research is. Can you explain really quickly, what is the difference between action research and regular research in academia?
Well, absolutely, and there's probably really not a significant distinction between the two because the primary purpose is to inform practice. The major difference would be as a practitioner, so in my case I was a classroom teacher, I wanted to know specifically in my school classroom-based context, how is this instructional strategy impacting my students? So action research was a way for me to inform my own teaching practices. Actually in higher education we call it scholarship of teaching and learning. So some researchers have found a way to then bring that now to other disciplines beyond education because educators have been doing action research for a long time.
Exactly. That is fantastic. Fascinating. Okay, so Laurie, why do you feel so passionate about research? I mean, what is it that motivates you to actually teach research and actually basically develop your career around research? What is it about research that motivates you that much?
Well, I think I've always been interested in knowing why. I'm a curious person, and so I've always wanted to know the why in things. So even when I look back at my childhood, elementary, middle school, high school, things that piqued my interest were things that enabled me to find answers to why. So history fairs, science fairs, research papers that we were required to write, but I don't think I ever actually put a label of myself as a researcher until I was in higher education. I'm a writer, I love to write, so obviously the two kind of go hand in hand. Many years ago, I attended a training for science, trying to encourage science instruction among girls. And one of the things that the presenter talked about is she used to do an activity with her students, and she would say, draw a picture of a scientist.
Okay.
Well, as you can probably assume, most individuals' pictures resemble a white man with crazy hair. We know him by the name of Albert Einstein. But what's interesting is that's not the demographic of our classrooms. And basically what this lady was trying to do was get every student to see themselves as a scientist. And so I kind of feel that that's my goal as a teacher educator, and even just as a practitioner in education, is so everybody can see themselves as a researcher, no matter what their professional affiliation is, what their education level is, because basically research just informs practices. It's no different than in your personal life. Before you purchase a car, you might conduct some formal research and look at consumer reports, or you might conduct some Google searches, kind of like you referred to at the beginning of this podcast, to just find out what's the best car that I can get for what I'm willing to spend. That's research. Just basically when you conduct research in a more structured setting to where you're kind of disseminating empirical findings, there would be a bit more of a tighter structure involved, but essentially we use research daily, both professionally and personally.
Correct. That is fascinating. Now, what can you tell the audience about, the potential impact that learning about research may have on educational settings? Because we have a lot of principals and superintendents and higher ed administrators that may be looking at us right now. And of course, they may be familiarized with research, but what is your opinion in regards to the potential impact that learning about research may have on educational settings in general?
Well, research is what enables education to maintain professional integrity. And ultimately, it's a professional responsibility of all that are involved. And you mentioned several stakeholders. So we need research as educators in order to inform what we do. It helps ensure we have wise decision-making, which could mean for academic reasons, financial reasons, social reasons, and not just for student learning, but even for, how do you mentor new teachers in the profession? How do you support veteran teachers in the profession? How do you incorporate the use of support personnel like paraprofessionals in an effective way? So basically everything we do in education, no matter what level, must be informed by research. Otherwise, we don't really have the integrity as a profession. It's kind of like I always like to tell students when I'm working with them, that would be like going to a dentist or a doctor or a lawyer that isn't using research to inform their practices. Hopefully you're consulting to make sure they have the proper credentials and that they're using the most, innovative and current practices. And we have the same responsibility to those that we serve, which are the students and their parents, guardians, and caregivers.
That is fantastic. Now, you have seen lately across highly functional school districts, I would say large districts, that they're coming out with these research and development departments, sort of like imitating the private sector, with the research and development, departments, especially in the pharmaceutical industry or, the medical industry. So you're seeing more and more large districts coming out with these departments and trying to implement those. What is your personal take on those initiatives? I mean, do you think that school districts and universities should have their own research and development department, or do you think that they should outsource that with other entities or consultants? I mean, what is your general take on that?
Well, to be honest with you, I'm not really a fan of outsourcing when you're talking about school district business, because every school district is unique and every school district serves such a specific context. So if you did invite consultants from the outside to come in, I would say definitely provide a balance with internal stakeholders, because that way they can help guide those decisions to what's best for that situation. But, in a large school district like Dallas, Houston, Austin, within the state of Texas, they must have a division like that because they serve so many students. And not only in them facilitating research, they get a lot of requests for entities that want to come in and conduct research. So they have to have a way to administratively handle that type of business. I know some of the larger school districts actually charge fees in order to review research proposals. And again, that's just because that requires time and energy and personnel, and there's expenses related to that. In smaller school districts, it could be as simple as inviting multiple stakeholders, school board members, parents, community members, as well as educators that are employed by the school district, in order to make decisions and ultimately decide as a team, do we need to conduct this research endeavor? And not only that, but are we actually going to use our findings to guide future decision making? So I think the best thing to do in a research and development type approach is to also ensure you're committed to actually using those findings in a meaningful and purposeful way.
Absolutely, that makes sense. That makes sense. Now, what about the best ways to teach research to students throughout different levels? For example, let's start with, I want to pick up your brain on that area. So let's start with high school students or even elementary students. Let's start with elementary. What are your thoughts about or recommendations for teachers who may be looking at us right now, new teachers or veteran teachers who want to start to be a little more proactive, teaching research skills to students? Basically starting early, so they can start acquiring those skills within their careers. What are your general recommendations for those teachers looking at us right now?
I'm so glad that you rewinded all the way back to the early years, because research can take place from pre-kindergarten on up. I think the first thing I would tell an educator is you need to be a researcher yourself. So you need to value it, you need to read it, you need to use it to inform your practice, and you need to share it. So that way, when students see it being modeled and seeing those discussions taking place among educators, or even telling your students, we're going to use this strategy instead because this is what it shows, it just really establishes that culture. And I think the best way to involve students in research before they actually start conducting it is have them read research and talk about it. And some of that might also involve incorporating fake research in order to develop those critical literacy skills. So that way students can start looking at things using kind of more higher order thinking skills, evaluating who's the author of this research, what is this research saying, who are they affiliated with, what's their purpose, bringing in that social justice orientation, who are the decision makers, what are the power structures here. So then that way they can start deciding what good research is. Oftentimes, in this day and age, technology is a godsend. However, a mere Google search can bring up a lot of bad information just as much as it brings in good information. So I think teachers need to also be familiar with what are the current skill sets that students need in this age, in the 21st century, as far as literacy goes. Libraries don't necessarily have shelves and shelves of books. There's lots of ways to access information digitally. So teachers need to be able to teach students how to do that, but to do it in a credible and reliable manner. And then involve students in research. Whenever I taught in the classroom, I typically taught fourth grade. I taught fifth grade 1 year because I have a strong background in writing. So every principal was like, okay, you're the writing teacher, you're teaching fourth grade. But, there always was a unit on research. But I think that research is something that can be integrated seamlessly throughout the year. Okay. So I turned to professionals like Stephanie Harvey, who has written many resources that helped me develop my skills as a teacher of research, to where sometimes students didn't even recognize they were doing research. They were just engaged in inquiry. And that really is the beginning of research. Letting students select topics, keeping them aware of current events. What's going on in your community? Well, let's write some letters. Let's get more information. Let's invite this guest speaker. Kind of having that inquiry-based approach to where when students conduct research, it's actually done authentically. And it's not just the unit you teach, you check off your box, and then you move on to narrative writing. Yeah. So I think there's many things. And I think most of all, teachers should just be a risk taker. Try an innovative approach. And if it sinks and it doesn't work, have a professional community that you've established of other teachers that are doing the same thing to problem solve, troubleshoot, and share what's working well.
That is fantastic. Now, when you look at the secondary education, you look at middle schoolers and you look at high schools, and I think I'm going to mix two questions with one in here. But, millennials and educators have a lot of competition with millennials nowadays, and I'm a dad of two millennials, so I can speak, with property in that area. You have iPhones, you have Netflix, you have so many areas that you have to compete. Trying to encourage and incentivize these kids to read. And also, they have their phones 24/7 with them, and they're constantly researching without realizing it through different engines. Google is one, Facebook, and many others. What recommendation would you give to secondary education teachers to, on one side, motivate millennials about research, and number two, explaining to secondary students that research is more than just Google function? Mm-hmm. What is your general take on that area? Kind of a long question.
No, right, but it makes complete sense because, just like I said earlier, the technology makes things much easier for us to do. It provides us with greater access to resources, but in the same breath, we have to teach students and ourselves how to be responsible with them. Right. There might be teachers that they themselves rely on things that they find on the internet, and so we kind of have to practice what we preach also. Right. When I use a teaching strategy, yes, it might be online, but ultimately I need to be able to defend it and justify it with empirical findings that have been published maybe in well-known research reports or peer-reviewed journals, or a more credible authority than just a blog post that somebody put online. Yeah. I think we need to teach students go back to the original source. That's kind of like, if I cite something, that's great, but go back to who I cited to see if I really cited it correctly.
Yeah.
So I think that basically teachers just need to be familiar with who these millennials are. Our learners are very different. I mean, I've only been out of the classroom since 2009, and I can already tell a distinct difference whenever I go back into schools, and that's been less than 10 years. Mm-hmm. And so as a teacher, it's my responsibility to get to know my learners, get to know what tools they have access to, and get to know how I can still teach the fundamental skills, but also how I can embrace the more innovative and current skills that are available. I think it's wrong to keep teaching practices the same way they always were. That's not always best, but I think that there's ways we can teach our students to use these technologies in a responsible way. I mean, I do informal research every day. It never fails. If my phone's not by me when I'm watching a movie, because it's like, oh, what other movie? I need to look that person up. Or, oh, I think they're in this. I mean, I'm always looking up things. If I'm watching a documentary or a loosely based fictional story that's based on, I'm looking to see how true to the story it is the whole time while I'm watching the movie. But I think that behavior is good too, because it's fostering that deep inquiry in everything. And so I think it's wrong to not keep that flame going.
Yeah, and I think you hit a good point when you said going to the original source, because I think at least teaching the students and teaching the teachers that you need more than one source to corroborate a potential fact or a potential tendency. And I think, sometimes it becomes really easy just to go to one search engine or one particular source and say, okay, because this particular source or this particular engine says the sky is blue, then we want to assume that the sky is blue all the time. And I think that's one of the mistakes that sometimes we fall into, especially, the millennials and new generation, because of the accessibility.
Oh, excellent point. Right. Well, and I mean, I would be lying if I didn't say I start at Wikipedia sometimes just to get foundational information.
Absolutely.
But then I definitely consult multiple sources, and sometimes it's accurate and sometimes it's not. But then that's also where I understand the nature of that type of platform. I mean, that's also teaching students. Typically, if you go to, an agency's research reports, those are going to be credible sources that you can easily pull up in a Google search, rather than a less formal, like a blog, or, sometimes they put, like, from Twitter, kind of a compilation of posts. Sure. And it's okay to look at those, but then, like you said, corroborate those with authentic sources.
That's fantastic. Now I'm gonna ask you a personal question in regards to your tendencies in research before we go through your final recommendation to everybody. We know that there are three major areas of research. We have the qualitative research, we have the quantitative research, and we have the mixed method that they have both of them. I want to know what is your preferences and why.
Well, as a researcher, I would say my preference is probably mixed,
Okay.
with a little bit leanings towards qualitative because I like to know the why. I like to discover the why. But I also know the importance of the quantitative aspect because often in education, that's how decisions are made. It's based on the numbers. And so it would be a disservice, I think, to just focus on one area because in education, we have a number of stakeholders and we have to be sure we're meeting their needs. And sometimes the numbers tell a different story than the text does. As a consumer, I definitely prefer a mixed approach because I like to know the whole picture also. But then also to consult multiple studies to kind of see how they are similar as well as different.
That is fantastic. Laurie, what are your recommendations for educators that may be looking at us right now that want to start incorporating research within their lesson planning? We have a lot of PLCs, professional learning communities, that are, discussing data over and over again. Regardless of the grade level in pre-K through 12, what are your recommendations for teachers across core subjects to start integrating research within their lesson planning?
Well, I think the first step would be to consult with administrators, and that probably would begin with campus administrators to determine how they can be supported. I think it's one thing to expect, ask, encourage teachers to do something, but they have got to have the support, and that support comes from their administration and their school district. And if once everybody's involved, and support doesn't always have to be financial, but there may be resources that need to be purchased. There may be professional learning and trainings that teachers would like to go to,
Correct.
but then some of it might just be creating the time for that. Mm-hmm. One of the school districts where I'm at, Canyon ISD, actually incorporated a 0 hour on Mondays for their teachers. That way, it's a professional learning community for the teachers who don't normally have time during the school day to consult with one another. And so during that time like that, those teachers can then kind of develop like a network. And I think that's so rich in education. I don't know about you, Antonio, but I have several people, and one of your colleagues is one of them, to where if I'm just trying to brainstorm or troubleshoot, I'll call them and together we can kind of figure out either an alternate approach or just celebrate things that we're doing in our classrooms.
Yes.
So I think those factors are definitely important. And also the partnerships between pre-kindergarten and 12th grade schools and higher education is critical. So start building those partnerships among institutions because one helps the other. It's mutually beneficial.
That is fantastic. Fascinating. Now, what about your recommendations for school administrators and district officials who may be looking at us right now and want to start promoting research within their agenda, trickle it down to lesson planning and to different campuses, kind of transforming their institution in a research-based organization, across the board?
Well, you almost just said what it is. It has to be a culture within the organization. So it's kind of like the teachers turn to the administrators for support. Well, campus administrators need to turn to the district for support, and even parents, school board members, and whomever. It becomes a culture. Once it becomes a culture, it's very easy for new people to then kind of set in and assume that, and then for those that are experienced to kind of buy into it over time. They themselves need to be researchers. So, when they have their faculty meetings weekly, monthly, or however often they're held, have the teachers share findings from their research. Make that a regular part of the conversation that takes place in schools. And I think more importantly, what they need to do is work with the teachers and then also disseminate the findings even beyond the school campus, maybe at school board meetings, maybe to Lions Club or other community organizations and agencies, because then it gives some real value to what those findings say. So it's kind of like administrators don't necessarily, they work for the teachers, and so their role is critical, because without them, the teachers cannot be supported in what they do.
That is fantastic. Well, Laurie, I want to thank you one more time for your time.
Yes.
Folks, also remember that we have this interview and many others in Let's Talk About Education with Antonio Corrales YouTube channel, sterlingevaluationassessment.com. And please help somebody today, and see you next time.
Thank you.